All right, this is what Europe looked like in around the year 1140 till about 1400. This map specifically is at about 1200 CE, and you can see the different kingdoms that we have. Notice that in Spain at the bottom we have the Muslim dominions, and then you have the different kingdoms, including Aragon, Castile, Portugal, and Leon. And then the Holy Roman Empire is very large, so take a look at that. Notice that Italy is divided up as well. We don't have Italy as we have it today, but it was divided up into different states and kingdoms. And then England is, you can see kind of shaded in the purple, how it doesn't include Wales, the tan area off to the left, nor does it include Scotland. So this is the world that we're talking about when we talk about the Gothic world. And it was a term coined during the Renaissance. Initially, it was applied to all medieval art, which from the perspective of the Renaissance seemed crude and irrational and judged to be the work of barbarians. So we get the name Gothic after the Visigoths, who had sacked Rome in 410. This style attempted to help the observer rise above the physical world into the spiritual world, and it dominated Western Europe for about 300 years. It replaced the Romanesque style, but it will take on regional characteristics as it spreads, and it adapted to all types of structures, including churches, town halls, residences, and synagogues. Okay, for historical context, commerce will expand with the invention of international banking, which developed in Paris, and that became the mercantile hub of Europe. And while towns gained increasing prominence, the majority of the people still lived in the rural territories. Nonetheless, towns become much more important in regards to centers for artistic patronage, fostering strong communal identity through public projects and ceremonies. And Paris is considered the leading intellectual center between the 12th and the 13th century. The University of Paris is going to be the model for later European universities, including Cambridge and Oxford. And universities will eventually begin to supplant monasteries as centers for learning. Next, we see the rise of scholasticism, which was a new rational approach to philosophy and theology. They're trying to reconcile Christian theology with classical philosophy. So they examined, questioned, and clarified and codified Christian dogma and practice. Thomas Aquinas, he lived between 1225 and 1274. He wrote Summa Theologica, which was an encyclopedia that set out to systemize and encompass all knowledge on theology in the world. And this relates to every aspect of the universe, to God and his created universe. He uses Aristotelian logic to comprehend the religion's supernatural supernatural aspects, setting up the foundation to which Catholic thought even rests today. He really made Paris the intellectual center of Europe, though. Some think that this development in thinking relates to the geometrical order that permeates Gothic cathedrals, as well as the new interest in depicting the natural world in sculpture and painting with the cathedrals, as well as new interest in as well as the new interest in depicting the natural world in sculpture and painting. Okay, so the Crusades, again, will have an influence here because it began in the late 11th century but continues into the Gothic period, but with little political or military success. But it does encourage the development of banking systems, and that's because as the people who were going on the Crusades, they needed access to money as they were traveling, so that was important. They also developed new methods of taxation and a more complex money economy. It also inspires many scientific and philosophical developments and that is really due to the contact with the Muslim world. And then in regards to monasticism, monasticism shifts because we see urbanization. So, urbanization will shift monasticism from rural retreats to large complexes within cities where monks can serve the poor and sick and preach the word of God. One group of monks were known as the Franciscans. It was founded by Francis of Assisi, and it was a new begging order. And the Franciscans will emphasize poverty and humility. This new emphasis on human emotion is interpreting the lives of Jesus and the saints. So we're seeing a representation of a shift in monastic life from isolated living to serving the people. Monks could serve the poor and sick and preach in a language of the people. Another change in regards to this is urban cathedrals. Cathedrals are seats of the ruling bishops. That's the difference between a cathedral and a church. A cathedral is the home of the bishop, whereas there are many local churches, but not necessarily the actual cathedral. And that's going to supersede rural monasteries as centers of religious and cultural patronage. The cathedral precincts functions as little towns. It was a palace for the bishop, housing for the clergy, workshops for artists and laborers who built the structure, and it was funded through the bishops and other clergy salary donations, and also royal and aristocratic patrons, and sometimes even by charging people for doing relic tours, where they send relics out into the local area to get additional donations. So the advances in building technology increases financial resources, and a new intellectual and spiritual aspirations led to the development of new art and architecture that express religious and political values of a monastic community. Bishops and abbots also are going to compete to race to build the largest and most elaborate churches. And within 100 years, an estimated 2,700 churches were built in just the French royal dominion territory surrounding Paris alone. Okay, lastly, we have the Capetian monarchy, which will consolidate royal authority. The Capetians begins with Louis VII. Capet was the last name, but when you talk about the group, it's Capetians. And he consolidated royal authority in the region around Paris and began to exert more control over powerful nobles in the region. Later, French kings continued to consolidate royal authority and increase their domains and privileges. This also sparks a building boom within the growing centralization in the government of Paris. This concentrated activity in the capital may have provided the opportunity for the developments in architectural technology and the new ways of planning and thinking about buildings that led to the birth of this new style. All right, let's talk about style. For stylistic characteristics in architecture, let me go back to that. Okay, so first of all, the development of Gothic architecture began with the abbot Suger, Suger, when he updated the Abbey Church of Saint Denis. It's spelled Denis. And Suger was a friend and advisor to the French kings Louis VI and VII. This one church renovation started a movement because it was such an important church. This is the church where the coronation regalia was stored and where the kings and queens were buried. And it's just a little bit outside of Paris. While many of these features have been used elsewhere before, it is their accommodation into a coherent system that is new for the Gothic period. So the floor plan of Gothic churches aren't necessarily too different from previous plans. Instead, what is different is the construction and decoration techniques. First of all, the Latin cross plan is the projecting transept that marks the transition from the nave to the choir. and this originally derived from Old St. Peter's Basilica plan. The main entrance portal is typically pointed west, and it still has the apse and radiating chapels and the ambulatory. We're now also going to see the pointed arch, which continuously directs our eyes upward. And then ribbing is another technique which creates definition, and it creates a series of lines to keep our eyes moving forward. And then we have the stained glass windows. These are designed to lead worshipers to imagine the glories of heavenly Jerusalem or the city of God in paradise. And like exterior sculptures, the figurative imagery in the stained glass instructed the populace through symbolic and imagery and narratives from the Bible. And this one here is called a rose window, and that has a lot to do with the where it's located in the church and the fact that if it looks like a flower. Okay, another thing that they included were jam statues, which we'll talk about when we get to one of our pieces. They also included deep porches in the front doorways. Another important part is verticality, or the use of space in regards to going much higher. It urges the viewer to look upward and experience the sense of weightlessness and immateriality. It relates to the idea of spiritual enlightenment. The high, narrow nave is a climax of a long tradition of Gothic art in which architectures try to invent physical space that would express the spiritual goals of the Christian religion. A tall church was thought to please God. Also served as a local emblem of the town's piety, wealth, power, pride, and status. So the height increases with new construction over time. Okay, another feature of this time period is the flying buttress, which I'll show you pictures of in a second. Flying buttresses they are basically supports that are hidden from the interior view by the stained glass windows, but are clearly visible from the exterior. In addition to the added support, they also visually add to the lightness and energy of the exterior. They also had spires, which here's the picture of the buttresses. And then they would have spires, which would ideally be 7, one at the crossing and 3 other pairs at the transept and the main entrance. It suggests the dissolution of the mass of the structure consistent with the motivations and aspirations of the cathedral builders. Next would be tracery. Tracery is stonework or woodwork that forms a pattern and in the open space of the windows or applied to wall surfaces. I'm going to show you what a quatrefoil is in a little bit, but quatrefoil is another 4-lobe decorative pattern, or there'd be a trefoil or a 3-lobe decorative pattern. They use slender proportions. Proportion of the height to width is typically 2:1 or 3:1. In comparison to Romanesque, which supported the weight on massive walls, the Gothic structures are supported on slender piers that are reinforced by, here's the quatrefoil, and then there's the trefoil. And so it gives the experience of bright, mystical views and an otherworldly effect. Despite construction campaigns that often lasted decades and sometimes even centuries, not one of the French cathedrals, the Gothic ones, were ever fully completed, and that shows the ambitions and patrons of the architects. And we see it. There's also a cathedral in Spain right now called the La Sagrada Familia, and they're going to be still under construction. Here's the 3 recessed portals, and that leads into the Trinity and more parts of the belief systems of the church, and then the slender proportions. Okay, so this is it on the style. The next one's gonna be more on architecture and then getting into some of the pieces.